I feel like diet culture sets you up to never be good enough.
Did you burn 500 calories on the treadmill today? No? Me either.
I mean, anybody can sit with us. We're just really not about diet culture.
But literally, happiness doesn't come from a low-calorie, high-intensity life. I actually do like carrots.
I do too. They're my favorite.
Welcome to the Fit Fueled Free podcast.
So basically, diets suck. Hey guys, welcome to episode 55. I'm Jenna.
I'm Danielle.
And today we are going to cover a topic that comes up a lot in discussion. I've been asked this question a lot. I know Danielle has as well, being a registered dietitian, but we are going to cover how to navigate nutrition post-eating disorder or disordered eating and how to kind of navigate it and have a healthy and balanced approach to it without kind of falling back into old eating disordered/disordered eating habits or kind of mindsets, and give some tips on how to go about that process and kind of keep yourself, moving forward on that journey as opposed to falling back into decisions or mentalities or habits that kind of will pull you back into that disordered and obsessive type of behavior.
And I'm going to kind of take the lead on this one just as the nutrition expert, and then we're going to do an episode on this as well for exercise where Jen's going to do more of the talking on this. But one thing I wanted to make sure and clarify before we get any further with this episode is that this is not a substitute for medical advice, for therapy, or to replace individualized nutrition recommendations or treatment. And so because this is something we're often asked, we want to kind of give that foreshadowing and even some validation, but make sure that this isn't, while it could help you get to where you need to go to get help, that this isn't to suffice for treatment. And there are some times where people may not have access to eating disorder treatment, whether it's outpatient or inpatient, and, they do their own exploration and things like that. And I think that's super wonderful, but just know that if you do need help, that it is always okay to ask for that. And we're going to provide some links in the show notes of this episode of some places where you can go for more information. All right. If you ask this question, the first thing that pops into my mind is, I wonder if you're thinking that there's a certain way you have to eat and even move your body in order to maintain the diet culture thin ideal, but also not engaging in disordered behavior. And I want to clarify that Jenna and I have been super transparent in our own personal growth, and we do not believe that there is a preferred or ideal body size. We both hold thinner bodies in the spectrum of bodies, but that is not because we are repeatedly engaging in disordered behaviors, but that are just like less than eating disorders. That's not what's going on here. And I think there's a space in social media and just in recovery work where it's like, okay, we're no longer fully restricting or binging and purging, but we may still be like not even remotely like giving our bodies what we need or resting or anything like that. And that is still heavily disordered behavior. And so those kinds of tips are never going to be something that you're going to hear from us to engage in that in order to keep yourself a certain size or to shrink your body. The utmost respect to everyone and their own opinions about what your body should look like, and extending all the compassion there. But if that's what you're looking for, I hope that you still continue listening to this episode, but that is certainly not what kind of advice or information that is going to follow. And so I kind of think on the other side of that, it's kind of wanting some like clarification on what things could look like once you continue to grow in your journey of less and less disordered behavior till you get to the point where you are in recovery or recovered. And There's a link from Montanito, which is a major recovery center, that talks about the differences in the definitions of what is recovery, what is recovered. And so I am going to read those just to kind of put some clarification on it, because I think that those terms can get pretty fuzzy and just confusing. So recovery is the process by which someone overcomes an eating disorder. So during recovery, patients undergo a variety of therapies to help them understand why their disorders exist and to challenge these disordered thoughts and behaviors. During this process, they may also address co-occurring issues such as depression, anxiety, personality disorders, or other problems that make eating disorders more difficult to treat. For many patients, recovery will continue even after treatment. The process of recovery is not complete until the individual is no longer affected by the eating disorder in any way. The recovery process looks different for every patient, and the time it takes to complete can vary considerably. Some people could have a recovery period that lasts for many years, while others may recover fully within months of completing a professional treatment program. And it's not a race or competition in any way for how long it takes someone. And typically the longer that you've dealt with it, it's going to take longer to get to a place where it's not ruling your life anymore. So when someone is in recovery, they're in that process. So you're actively involved in treatment, which could be at a treatment facility or a day treatment program. But the phrase in recovery could also be used to refer to someone who has completed a treatment program but does not consider himself or herself to be fully recovered from the eating disorder. So they still engage in those behaviors that are disordered, but they're no longer actively in a treatment program. But I think that's where a lot of people catch me in my work, is in the outpatient setting. You don't necessarily need outpatient if you were fully recovered. So that's kind of like the step down from being in treatment or being in a PHP or an intensive outpatient situation. So that's a lot of what I deal with day to day. So the definition of being fully recovered is that an individual must be completely free from all symptoms of his or her eating disorder. In addition, the person must have also accepted his or her natural body size and shape, and he or she will no longer engage in any behaviors related to food or body size that could be considered self-destructive. Instead, this person will have an appropriate perspective on food, body weight, body image, and other issues. Full recovery is the ultimate goal of anyone who has an eating disorder, as it signals the individual is now free from the majority of the negative effects of the illness. So one thing, if you don't identify as he or she, you're not excluded from this. So until they are accepted, that's something I didn't catch before I was reading this out loud, but just want to make sure pronouns are fully inclusive there. But also, I think there's another really blurry line here, is that when you're in full recovery, it doesn't mean that diet culture doesn't have any kind of influence or impact on you. And so that's where there's still a lot of like rampant disordered behaviors that even go encouraged and unchecked in treatment facilities, because you've got the actual eating disorder and then you have that layer of diet culture that perpetuates so much harm. And that's what Jenna and I spend the majority of our time talking about, is like the disordered behaviors of society and that are encouraged. So it doesn't mean that you're never going to have to do more like work to consider, like, okay, if you hear something and you're like, what's this about, to like think about it. And I don't think that is that definition, but that you're no longer engaging in the behaviors of the restriction and the desire to label foods as good or bad and all those things. It's like really getting to the bottom of food, body, movement is no longer. It's something that's still going to take up a lot of your time because we spend a lot of hours eating, and but it's not taking up all of your brain space. All right. So now that we've gotten through kind of some disclaimers and some definitions to make sure everyone's on the same page as we continue this conversation, the ultimate goal is going to be moving towards intuitive eating. And so while I think there are a lot of opinions around what intuitive eating actually even means, and I think that because we are free thinking human beings, like we're all going to have our own little interpretations of things anyway, and that's okay. But we're going to do a 10 episode series on that coming up very soon to get into the nitty gritty of it. But basically, you're able to, what I was just saying a second ago with recovery, it's not taking up all your brain space to be able to fuel your body and to make food choices. And that's kind of like the goal of intuitive eating. Like you're nourishing your body, moving appropriately where it's not too much, but it's joyful, all those things. And that's kind of like in brief where we're moving towards. And so that can be really daunting, especially for someone who has experienced like extreme restriction, to think, how am I ever going to honor my body with what I need, just relying on my hunger cues. But it can take a while for hunger cues to really come back and to be fully reestablished. And even like up to a year into engaging in those behaviors, and like you no longer have the mental restriction, but it can take a really long time for your body to kind of come back around to asking for those things. And so just try not to give up or feel like you're broken or you failed because of that. Because that's normal for we get very disconnected from those things because we, in a sense, have to, in order for the disorder to function, we have to stop being ruled by our body knowing what to do. So it's okay if you're scared of the concept of intuitive eating. It's okay if you don't even think that that's what you want for yourself, but it's just the easiest way for me to describe what we're working towards. Because even if you don't like thoroughly work through all of the principles of it, in some regard, that's kind of where you have to move. But there's some other terms that people refer to it, like Carolyn Dooner's book, the F-It Diet. She refers to it as that, like rather, it's a little even more like screw everything than intuitive eating, but it's still aligned, I think, in the same principles and the same like ideology. I don't know why I can't say that word. But there's different ways that you can refer to it as, and that's totally fine. So the other thing that's going to complicate this process a little bit, and I don't mean that in a negative way, but just something to consider, is that food security is first and foremost the biggest step to moving forward in any kind of healing work when it comes to nutrition in your body. Because if you don't have access to food, you're not going to be able to eat enough. And so that is financial and like literally not having enough money for your groceries. But I'm also talking about like the mental part of saying, oh, well, I have this stuff here, but I can't eat that because it's not healthy enough. Like, all foods are going to have to be considered acceptable, because that mental restriction has to come down, and it does over time, but both of those things are super important in being able to recover, because I literally don't care if you eat a single vegetable, to be honest. Like, we got to get you to eat enough food first. So whether that's an economic barrier that we need to address, or it's the mental barrier, which is, both of those things are ongoing things that have to be considered in order to eat enough, but that's super important to have that security. And so just considering, like, are you eligible for food stamps if you don't have enough money for food? And I even found out recently, I wanted to share that if you do have an EBT card, you can actually get groceries delivered. So it debits out of that, but that's really helpful for someone who doesn't have transportation and also has food insecurity, and that's probably not something that's like advertised. So just FYI on that. And I also recently I've heard of these things happening, but for the first time, there was like a bundle of produce at Kroger that was like reduced price, and I haven't actually seen this. I've heard of this concept, but we saw it. And so just looking for things like that, can be helpful as well, because it seems that we're making like a collective effort, especially because of the economic hardship that so many people are going through right now due to lots of loss of jobs with COVID. Just it's okay to look for those if you need help with food accessibility, and also food pantries as well. Okay. Is there anything else you want to add so far before we get into...
No.
Okay. All right. So, reestablishing hunger cues. So, like I said, it can take a really long time for this to come back. And it kind of sucks because when we want to eat intuitively, but we think about, like, logically, I'm not hungry enough for that food, you are going to have to override your body telling you it's not time to eat in order to eat enough. But it's not 100%, but typically your body will start to adapt to that pretty quickly, just like it adapted to you not eating enough. And it, in a lot of ways, became adjusted to that process, even though it wasn't okay or a healthy thing for your body. So being scheduled and regimented in the sense of like planning to be eating every 2 to 4 hours is like my biggest recommendation there, because if you go too long, then we run into the issue of getting overly hungry or having like blood sugar dropping or all these things. And it's not because I'm worried you're going to overeat, quote unquote, but just because that can add just like so much craziness, and it can worsen our mental health symptoms. And just keeping your blood sugar stable throughout the day is one of the best things you can do for yourself when you're trying to work on your mind. And that is the root of what's going on with an eating disorder, right? It's a mental health diagnosis. So we have to be fueled, and that's the goal of it. It's also for your brain. So we're trying to reestablish hunger cues. And as they start to come back, it can be very tempting to, like, if you have a set schedule, because that helped to guide you to eat enough, then it becomes, oh crap, now I have this set schedule that I need to try not to like wait till 1 p.m. to eat if I'm hungry at 12:02. And that is difficult. And so the timing is important when it was established, but once you're starting to get hungry again, even though that can be really scary, that's actually a tremendous victory, because that means your body's working with you again and telling you, hey, like now is time to eat. I know that in the past I may have let you wait another hour, but today it's time. And that's something to practice, because that's how we just become continually in tune with our body and honoring that. And so I understand there's going to be times where you don't have access to eat right when you get hungry, and that's not my point, but allowing yourself to, if you're able to. And also that means knowing that if you are not going to be able to eat and you roughly know when you get hungry, don't use that opportunity as a time to restrict. Eat something when you're not even hungry beforehand, because it's just setting your body up to be fueled. And you may still get a little bit hungry, but at least hey, I'm covered for this brief period. Like if it's something strange with your work schedule or with physical activity or travel or anything like that, like that's also okay too. So sometimes it involves fueling yourself strategically before you even have gotten the hunger cues, but that's still a very intuitive thing, because it's just using like your brain knowledge to say, hey, I need to eat, and I can't eat if I'm typically hungry between 12 and 1. I'm going to have to eat right now.
I like that you said that, because sometimes people use intuitive eating to be like, well, I can't eat now because my body's not intuitively hungry. But I think that's the beauty of it, is knowing, like, you're still honoring yourself because you're assessing what's going to be happening in the very near future and being like, well, I'm not going to be able to take care of that need at that particular moment, but I can take care of it now. And that in turn is actually honoring yourself, as opposed to being like, well, I'm just going to let myself starve the rest of the afternoon because I'm not hungry yet, but I won't be able to eat later.
And that's a hard habit to break.
Yeah.
So just remember, just because you choose one way or the other one day does not mean that that decides what happens tomorrow.
Yeah.
Because the process of recovery is a non-linear journey. So it's normal to have good and bad days, and you have to give yourself permission for that in order to allow things to move forward. But over time, with repeated exposure to these things, it gets a little bit easier. All right, so now I want to talk about fear foods, because these are going to be addressed certainly in treatment, no matter what level of care you're in. We're going to talk about the foods that you are so afraid to eat and that you don't allow yourself to eat, but you actually enjoy eating. And so essentially it's forcing yourself to do the thing you're afraid of doing so that you can prove on the other side that nothing bad happened to you. And it's doing that over and over again until you're no longer afraid of it, because you realize that the fear was pretty much irrational, and you can't necessarily talk yourself out of that until you know that you're going to be able to get to the other side. And something that I see happen sometimes, especially working outpatient, is, you know, life goes on and there may be things that pop up that have to be more acutely addressed in your life than your recovery work. And so challenges sometimes kind of fall to the wayside because something pops up. But if you are doing that regularly, and then, you know, now it's been 2 months since you've given yourself a fear food challenge, or even just something you feel like uncomfortable buying and keeping in your house, and you put too much time between that, it just gets harder to kind of come back to doing it. So once that's in place, I would really strongly encourage you to kind of make a mental note of, you know, how people in like our culture, they'll call it a cheat meal, quote unquote, like you need a recovery like meal. Like you need something that's challenging you to remind you, because it has to be like, we know as people, the behaviors we engage in on a regular basis are kind of what we are or do, or there are habits. And so if you put too much space between that, that's a big thing I see in outpatient, is then it's like, okay, well now I can't deal with this thing again, and we got to continue doing it enough times until it becomes more comfortable. And COVID was a really terrible thing to happen for that, because it really took away our abilities to do a lot of those things, unfortunately, for a long time this year. And so anybody that has worsened symptoms after COVID, just the mental stress and the physical barriers, you are completely seen for that. All right. A plan of action. So what I mean by this is, when you are in recovery and you're working with someone, whether it's a dietitian, a therapist, or your PCP, or you're at a treatment facility, meal planning is going to be a really integral part of the work, because you need to know, one, what you're expected to eat, how much you need for your body roughly, which is, you know, a judgment that your treatment team makes to make sure you're eating enough food. And that also, if you feel like you have an issue with overeating, that's still you. This isn't all about refeeding as far as gaining weight, but even if you are in a larger body, sometimes you do still need to gain weight. And that is a really big barrier because of the fat phobic society we live in, but that is still a truth for you. So that meal planning is there to take away the stress so that you know what your expectations are, because you may already be extremely stressed about just getting through that meal. So having to think about what the meal's made up of is just an additional barrier that doesn't really need to be there. And to be honest, meal planning is stressful for pretty much everyone. Because it just it requires a lot of thought when you don't feel secure in knowing you know how to feed yourself. And so as you move through the stages of recovery, you're going to take on more and more of that role of choosing what food you're eating for yourself, because ultimately you have the autonomy to make those choices. And so as you move through that, just remember, if you don't have groceries in your home or you don't have a plan of what you're going to eat in 3 hours, it's going to make it really hard to follow through with your recovery behaviors rather than the disordered ones, because we don't have a ton of time to work with from meal to meal before we start facing a potential trigger, or like I said, your mental energy is going to decline, and then it makes it harder to make those decisions. So just trying to always have some kind of plan for the next meal opportunity, which making sure you have food just stocked up it's worth sitting down and taking that time. I'm not saying you have to meal prep everything or anything like that, but just having food that's accessible does have to be a priority. And that's why I talk about food security, because there's a lot of rules in our culture about what we are allowed to eat and not allowed to eat. And some of that stuff costs more money than most people can spend. And so like that's really irrelevant until you can eat enough to sustain yourself. And just that plan of action is the foundation of being able to do that work. So not meant to be a super strict or rigid plan at all, but just covering the basis of your different food groups. And when you eat something, ideally you have more than one food group present. So there are a couple foods that already may have like carbs, fats, and proteins together, like yogurts, bars, ice cream, trail mix, things like that. Just a quick spitting out some things that come to my mind there. But otherwise, if it's like nuts and applesauce, like 2 random pairings, like don't just eat one or the other, because that way you're one, getting your nutrition covered, and you're covering your macronutrients without making it like so intense. And eating balanced, when I say that, does not mean that a fruit or vegetable always needs to be present. So like cheese and crackers would be another pairing of a snack that doesn't have a fruit or vegetable, but it's got your carbs and your proteins and fats covered. But it's literally balancing out the food groups. And so trying to understand that a little bit can be helpful. But I think typically, I have yet to have to do nutrition education extensively in an outpatient setting for anyone who's struggling with an eating disorder. But if you need help with that, I really do recommend the gentle nutrition part of intuitive eating, which we're going to talk about, because there are some general guidelines that can help. And my number one thing is always pair carbs with a protein or fat, because it just makes such a huge difference in actually fueling you. So foods that bring you joy and make you feel good physically. So when I jotted that, I saw that Jenna had some notes on this. So I'm going to let her talk about that part of like how she kind of incorporated some of that stuff, that like learning what you actually like to eat.
Yeah. So one of the things that was super helpful for me when I was trying to like implement some of the foods that I stayed away from when I was eating a super low calorie diet, I actually started to keep a journal. I found that to be like one of the most beneficial things. And what I would do is I would write down like how I was feeling right before I was about to eat. I would take a break during eating and write down like, okay, how am I feeling throughout this process? And then when I was finished, I would again come back to it and write how I felt at the end. And kind of whether that's like you give yourself a rating or you write down emotions or feelings, whatever, you feel like is going to be the most beneficial for you when you refer back to that. But also writing down foods that you enjoyed and like how you physically felt during the meal and eating it. Like how was the taste, and how, like, what other, like, did it bring back any memories? Like, I think because all of that is so intertwined, like food, memories, and experiences, it can kind of just reestablish that connection that you have or that you're trying to, bring back. And it can also help like regain hunger cues and intuition within yourself. And doing this along with like the food fears that Danielle was just talking about, because I like sometimes when you restrict or cut out a food so much that you avoid it, that you feel like you can't ever have it again because you've restricted it for so long that if you give it to yourself, you're like, well, I'm never going to stop eating it because I can't have self-control around it. Like sometimes, yes, it is a food that you genuinely enjoy. And, you know, typically we find that the foods that people cut out a lot are things that are deemed as like quote unquote unhealthy, such as like ice cream or high fat things like peanut butter or like desserts or cakes or whatever it is. But sometimes you'll find that like you have built it up so much in your head because you've restricted it that when you go to actually have it, like it may not be as satisfying as you thought it was. It was only satisfying because it was like off limits.
Yep.
And we always quote unquote what we want, what we can't have. And so kind of once you're in a place of being able to like test those food fears and incorporate those foods that you didn't allow yourself to have for a prolonged period of time, also writing down how you feel, how it tastes, what emotions come up when you're consuming that, and taking a moment to like take a break and really assess all of the things that you're feeling throughout that process, can really help your mind as you're going through that entire experience. Because you could find out, hey, I really do like ice cream and I'm going to continue to challenge myself with this so I can get to a place where I can have it in the house and have it if I want it and don't have it if I don't want it. Or it can also be a tool to be like, I actually really don't like ice cream as much as I thought I did. I just thought that I would have a lack of self-control around it because I haven't been able to have it for so long. And so it seems like a lengthy process and it seems overwhelming and like monotonous to be like, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to whip out my journal when I'm eating. You don't have to do it every time, like if you're with a group of friends, but I think it can be a really good first step. Like when you're at home or, you know, if you're eating with a friend or a spouse or a partner, whatever it is who you're spending that meal with, just being like, hey, like this is, you know, a strategy I'm implementing because hopefully that person would know what you're going through at that point. And be like, I just need to pause and assess how I'm feeling, you know, and every emotion that comes along with that experience.
And sometimes like it can really range how many times you have to actually like do the pen to paper thing. Cause I think every person's a little bit different, but sometimes like it might only be one time that you have to do that and it causes you to have like a click and then you're like, oh, like you don't have to write it. But the journaling part, I feel like even though we think it's so monotonous, like I love that you said that it doesn't have to be every time. It's not a food journal. You're not tracking for like being good or bad. You're doing it to help yourself so you can't fail at it. So like if you don't set those rigid expectations for yourself, it's a tool. And I think just that permission really helps us to be able to do it more from like a self-care, like this is the thing that helps, but no one's gonna be like, oh well, you like messed up because you didn't journal about how you felt about this food.
Absolutely.
So it's just an additional thing, and if that feels really scary, you may not be ready for that by yourself, which is why a lot of times I, even in an outpatient setting, still do meal support or a fear food with someone. So whether it's just helping them eat to get through a meal and deal with letting themselves be full and eat a full meal, or it's like challenging something, you don't have to do it by yourself. And so that is an opportunity for you as well. Because that's going to happen in a higher level care situation. That's going to be an expectation. But if you don't go to higher level care because one, you don't need to, or you don't have access, that's something that still does need to be addressed in some capacity. And just, it's all a bunch of exploration and curiosity, because there is no right or wrong foods to be eating, which I know is a frightening thing to hear, but that's where you end up on the other side. That does become a belief when you get to full recovery. I said a little bit ago about how caring about ingredients can be like a barrier to being able to eat enough, because it seems like there's certain foods we have to eat in order to be healthy. And I think sometimes that's where like that weird space I was talking about, where it's like kind of recovery but also still really diet culture, I think that's where we get stuck a lot, which was a big reason why like Jenna and I like have these conversations with on the podcast and with each other, because we're like, we don't want to belong to this like problematic, like in between space. And again, not because anyone's wrong or bad, but just because that's still like being ruled by diet culture, which is harmful. So if you have a food allergy or a legitimate sensitivity, cool, fine. You have to, unfortunately, read the labels to avoid certain things because it can impact your health. But if it's just because you have this information of clean eating, quote unquote, that's been given to you all over the place, that honestly is like what drives orthorexia, is like being so afraid of where a food came from or what's in it that you can't eat it. In my most recent lecture I was listening to from IADEP for my certified eating disorder registered dietitian credential, she was saying like if someone can't eat salmon because it isn't wild caught, like what's gonna happen to you? And like we have to bust that myth, that fear with reality, that literally nothing is going to happen to you if you eat farm raised salmon. But that is like a thing that everyone is terrified of because of diet culture, because we needed that next thing to be terrified of. And so I laughed because I was like, that probably hits home with the majority of people. And that it is, I'm so sorry to say, it is a disordered behavior to care so much about ingredients of your food that it gives you anxiety to eat something outside of your rules. That's not healthy. And so it's another unrealistic expectation. And unless it's something that doesn't provoke anxiety, and if you really just want to spend 4 times the amount on all your food, like I'm not judging you for that, but can you take a step back and look at how, that's curious, because not everyone has access to that. So again, another reinforcement that you can only be healthy if you have the most money and the most time to be worried about those things, which is not reasonable. So again, I'm not shaming caring about your ingredients, but if it's causing problems for you, there's disordered behavior going on there. And that is like around every corner. So if that is triggering for you, it's okay. Like deep breath, we are easily like brought into that. So I wouldn't just go like Googling things all over the place, but if you look for research that like backs up a lot of the things that we're told you have to do, there really isn't any. And so if that's the case, where did that information come from? And I'm not saying everything has to be heavily vetted with research, but having a science background, I do care about that. And that's kind of where we make decisions from. It's like, we know something is real for a reason, or are we just making it up because someone told us to, so they could control us in a sense. So I just really encourage you to question that information. And if you have a like non-diet doctor or therapist or dietitian or trainer, like they're going to remind you of those things because they know that that's not like how you have to be all ever or all the time. All right. Try not to get too ranty here because that stuff gets me fired up. So GI disturbances are normal. Yes, there are like true gut issues, and like you guys know, that's a big thing that Jenna has dealt with. But like if you have had an eating disorder, something is going to go on with your digestive system. It's to some capacity, like
it's unavoidable.
It really is. And it may be a different part of your digestive tract because digestion starts in your mouth. So like if you have bulimia, there's going to be other things like you may have swollen salivary glands, which are going to impact your ability to eat. And you may end up like with constipation after severe restriction. You're going to feel bloated if you eat more than you have eaten before. And that is okay.
Maybe say that one more time.
Okay. You are going to be bloated if you eat more than you have eaten before, because your belly is going to expand because there's food in there. And that can feel really uncomfortable, especially because we're constantly fed images of people who are sucking in or haven't eaten anything. But that's not how bodies work. I don't know anybody who, the joke of a food baby. That's not a fault. I think we laugh about it because we want to own that our stomach is protruded, but it's not a fault. Like that's just how
our bodies work.
Yeah, it's digestion. Like there's food there, and once you wake up and drink water, your belly's going to move as well. Like you are going to see a shift the second that you put anything in you after you've slept for hours
or have a bowel movement.
Yeah, exactly. So just remember that, because it gets so like convoluted. And I'm not a GI expert, and I will say that because I know there are a lot of things that can go seriously wrong, but the likelihood that that's actually what's happening, I think, is far less than what we're told. And then it becomes like, oh, I'm trying to resolve my GI issues, and I'm over here jumping up and down screaming, please just eat. But you can't because it's uncomfortable, and I get that, but you're not going to have regular bowel movements if you don't eat regularly and adequately. So, and the feeling of fullness that is really triggering if you are purging, that also is kind of that exposure of you have to sit through that discomfort, because that is a part of healing. And so, yes, ideally we get to a point where we're not binging, because that is a disordered behavior. And so, yes, that's a very different fullness than just from eating an amount to be comfortably full, but that's something that can be learned and retrained, just like hunger cues can be relearned and retrained in your body. So I would avoid the scale at all costs unless you have a healthcare professional telling you that for medical monitoring, you need to know the amount that you weigh, because it's too tempting and it's too much of a rabbit hole that you can go down. So if you want to be navigating nutrition in a healthy way after your eating disorder, it really doesn't matter what you weigh. And that's hard, but it really doesn't. So all those things being said, like the actual action items of them, we've shared some of those, but also I want to share kind of some of the things that you may not hear and that I typically have to tell my patients that I take on that either have left a recovery center or have just never gone, is that just because you do the work doesn't mean that everyone around you is going to do it. And we also, unfortunately, can't expect them to. Yes, we deserve to have support people in our lives, but everyone's relationship with food is their own. And so there may be very disordered. I mean, you may have to live with someone with an eating disorder, and hopefully not forever, but you can't change what they're doing. And so trying to come up with your whys and your coping mechanisms and the things that are going to help you be able to deal with that, because I need you to hear a triggering comment from someone and be able to still eat your next meal until you no longer care what anyone else says about it. And that takes time, and that's such a harsh reality. I hate that part, because that's a barrier that's really unjust and unfair. But that is the sad truth about recovery, is if you haven't had an eating disorder or you haven't worked with them intensely, you're probably not going to understand. And you can be supportive, but it's really hard. So educate your people who are willing to be educated. Educate your doctors if they don't understand. Please don't ever feel that you don't deserve to tell somebody that what they're saying or doing to you is harmful, but also realize, end of the day, we got to work within your team to be able to just let it go, because you're never going to be able to fully change those triggers that come up. And that's not a snap of your fingers kind of thing. That's a process, but that's just a gentle reminder that it's not right. It's not fair. You can be angry about it, feel all the feelings, but end of the day, we have to still like eat that next meal no matter what happens. Even if we are triggered and utilize a disordered behavior, like we still have to keep going. So finding those safe people, friend, family, therapist, your PCP, a dietitian, a trainer, anybody that can be your ally. And if you're afraid to tell anybody about it, I understand that too. But I just highly, highly encourage, if there is one person that you know that could be a safe recovery and accountability buddy for you, that is like, we can't do everything by ourselves. So I really, really encourage that. And again, remembering that it's a nonlinear journey, so you can have forward progress and still do something that is an old behavior or be triggered by it. And that's the thing too that really is so hard, is we can't remove our thoughts from our brains, but we can create space between our thoughts and the reactions that we have. So like, thinking of it basically as like harm reduction. Like, even if you're binging and purging and you are able to like put 30 extra minutes between your binge and your purge, that's actually progress, because you were able to do something to keep yourself from immediately going and utilizing that behavior. So like, there's so many tiny, tiny victories that can happen every single day that we're like, oh, well, I still purge. And it's like, well, actually, let's see this positive thing that you did. And that's something that, like, if we're only looking at the negatives, it's going to be essentially impossible to feel like you're doing the right thing, because there are going to still be negatives, but that doesn't mean that those positives don't exist. And you deserve to celebrate them and be proud of them, write them down, because I guarantee you they're there somewhere in any, and not to be like annoyingly cliche, but like in any bad day, there's probably something good that happened, but we have to choose to allow ourselves. I'm not saying that we're not like the bad doesn't exist because of that, and that's still there. It's real, it's valid, but like, we have to look at those good things, because that's how we see progress happening, or like any glimpse of hope happening in a recovery process. Okay, so I feel like, did I talk about tracking? Okay, so this is another kind of probably like answer people are looking for when they ask about like, how do you navigate nutrition after an eating disorder? Like, basically like again, like I hear, how much am I able to eat before I don't get fat? Like, that is what immediately comes to my mind, because we're trained to like think that way. And even if you are in a larger body, it's still applies to you. What can I do to not gain the weight back? But it is not my job to tell you what your body weight is supposed to be. So tracking to get enough food in can be helpful, and something I ask a lot of my patients to do, because I need you to have some kind of accountability when I'm not there with you every single day, that you're eating enough, and for you to know your expectations of how much you're supposed to eat. But once you've established that, and we know like, this is how much I eat, my hunger cues are back, like I'm satisfied with this amount of food, I have energy, like the bowel movements, like all those things, then you don't really need to be tracking anymore, because you're going to have gained that trust and confidence in yourself. And like, there are different situations that could change your nutrition needs, but that can be addressed later. Like, it's a fluid thing. Like it changes, but once you figure that out, you may need to brush up on some things, just to like, you know, if you start a new job and you don't drink as much water because you have to wear a mask now because of COVID, like, okay, like, let's work on hydration. Like, there's little things that can pop up all over the place. But I don't encourage tracking literally ever, outside of making sure you're getting enough food. And because somebody's like asking you to do that, because you know that you're struggling there and you need that support. So yeah, I think those are, I'm sure I haven't covered like every single thing, but just in trying to like do a brief like recap and some of the expectations. The only other thing I want to say is that Like in my personal journey, I realized how many foods I had forbidden to be in my house and in my life, and that came back. So like that's something you can expect, is to not, like, if someone tells me they ate a Pop-Tart for breakfast, I used to like cringe, and I literally don't care. All I hear is you ate something that's roughly 400 calories and it's good energy. Like that's what I hear. I hear 400 calories of energy to help you start your day. Like, and that probably sounds crazy and so upsetting to so many people, but that's the point of food. And to eat something is, that's beautiful. That's a good thing to do for yourself. So breathing through the discomfort or whatever your other coping mechanisms are, which Jenna had kind of taken some notes on this part, so I'm going to let her talk on that in a second, but that's huge. And your therapist is really important here. Like, please go to therapy, because I don't know when to tell you to push yourself, because that's between like you and your therapist know your mental stability. And so I'm only going to push as far as I know you're mentally able to handle it. And that's part of the reason why therapists and dietitians work together, is because there may be something else going on, or you're not even fed enough to like process some of that stuff to be able to cope. And that's where we might need to deal with distracting yourself to get through food before you can get through the discomfort part of it. And that's an individual like situation of how quickly you get to that part. Because at some point things are going to be really uncomfortable. And so eating before you go to bed if you're hungry is another thing that like I used to shame the crap out of myself for doing, or it would lead into me like binging, or even if I wasn't binging, just wanting to purge because I ate something outside of what I had planned for the day, which is super typical of having that kind of eating disorder. And then like some days I don't eat a vegetable and I don't die, whereas before it was so like I need to have like a vegetable every meal. Like if there isn't something available at a cookout, like I'm having a panic attack because I feel like I'm gonna double in size by tomorrow. So like those things will come with time, and those were just some, I've shared tons of them throughout this podcast history, but those are just some that popped into my mind that was like, you're not gonna think that this is gonna be something that's gonna change for you, but when you get to that recovery place, there's, you know, those couple and probably 1,000 more things that just become safer and just more positive that used to be so rigid and uncomfortable. So do you want to talk about some of your coping mechanisms?
So I had written down that like having any type of like coping mechanism in place or like implemented can be super beneficial in terms of like navigating food fears when like potentially a lot of past feelings or like habits or even behaviors want to resurface. Like having any type of game plan in place that, you know, like, okay, if this emotion, if this thought, if this behavior tries to come back up and like wean its way for like my undivided attention, I know that I have fill in the blank ready to go, so that way I can stay away from like falling back into that thought pattern, behavior pattern, whatever it is that was so consuming. And so some of the things that I would do is, on top of like keeping this journal, is if I started to feel super overwhelmed or anxious or like obsessive or wanted to like control or restrict, I would like obviously write that emotion down in my journal, kind of navigate and like try to figure out where it was coming from. And sometimes that would be me having to write it down or like turn to my husband and be like, we need to talk this out for a second, because I need you to help me rationalize like where is this fear coming from, because typically there's always, for the most part, a little bit deeper of a root, as opposed to you just being afraid of like the fat in ice cream. So that was something, just like letting my husband know like, hey, like I might have to, like, if I get really weird at like a meal, like I either need you to know to like ask me like, hey, what's going on? Do we need to talk? Or I need you to be ready for me to bring something up. I would sometimes like have to get up and like distract myself. So like not a distraction to like not deal with what you're feeling, but a distraction to keep yourself from falling into a controlling or like obsessive behavior or thought pattern. So whether that was like, okay, like let's go for a walk and then I'm gonna like revisit this, or like like go read a book or listen to music. I mean, really anything that you feel brings you like a sense of security and a sense of peace that can kind of take you out of that feeling of anxiety or being overwhelmed, or like feeling like you're gonna lose self-control in terms of whatever a lack of self-control looks like, to just kind of like ground yourself. Even sometimes when I would feel super anxious or overwhelmed, a technique that like my therapist had told me was to like, I don't remember what it's called, I don't know if it's grounding, but like literally either touching 5 things around you, like saying 5 things that you see, like textures, whatever it is, to kind of like bring you to the present moment, as opposed to like the anxiety that could be stemming from a past event or like a fear of like what's going to happen. That can be really beneficial as well. And then another thing that I would do when I would be about to eat is I was actually told by a practitioner I worked with, to take like 6 to 10 super deep breaths. So like breathe in through your nose and out through your mouth. I'm having to like do it to make sure I'm doing it the right way. In through your nose, out through your mouth. Like I would close my eyes, and that's literally like telling your body that it's like going into a state of rest. Like it's literally alerting your parasympathetic nervous system to like slow down. Like we're going to enter, like slow the digestion down, in the sense like we're not super anxious and we can like digest properly. Because when you're in the sympathetic, which is like stress, like fight or flight, like your digestion turns off, and it like is that much harder for you to like actually gain the benefits of like having that meal or that food. So taking like 6 to 10 deep breaths before I would eat would like bring my mind and my body into a sense of like inner peace and like a calming state, so that way I could be in tune with my body, like be in tune with the hunger cues, and even like putting my fork down after every couple of bites to be like, how am I feeling? Am I hungry? Do I want more? Am I satisfied? And I won't talk or go over this in too much depth right now, because I'm pretty sure this is covered in the intuitive eating book, and it's one of the tips. And like Danielle said, we're going to be doing like a 10-part series on that, so I won't really speak on that as much right now, but just kind of like grounding yourself in that moment and being present, and either taking breaths like throughout the meal to like bring yourself a sense of peace, and just like putting the fork down and like really like chewing to be like, okay, like what am I experiencing right now, as opposed to like rushing through a meal to eat it all, or like rush through it and kind of disregarding like the hunger cues that your body is trying to give you.
So yeah, wherever you're at within these things, you're not alone. And so again, a reminder that it's okay to ask for help.
Yeah.
It's not always easy to get what you need, but if you ask, that is better, and there's likely gonna open more options up than if you feel like you have to just like do this all on your own. Because I'm not saying it's impossible, but if you don't at least have a therapist, like it's gonna take longer than it should if it is even doable. And I never recommend doing this kind of work alone. And so the other thing, like with this question being asked, I think there may be a lacking potentially of people going from treatment to working with more of like a outpatient person, kind of like stepping down and kind of navigating back to regular life. And so if that is an option to you at all, I really would encourage that. Like, don't just say leaving a treatment facility, oh, I've done the work, I'm done, because you're 100% not. at that level, because you don't typically get to stay there long enough to be like, you're in a much better place, but there's still going to be the little day-to-day things and the stressors that pop up that like can be really triggering. And when you're under acute stress or chronic stress, it's like, well, why am I thinking about this now? It's like, well, because that's what you did as a coping mechanism, whatever it was. So it just wasn't serving you. So just asking for that help and giving yourself grace, as always, is going to be super important. So hopefully this helped a little bit with kind of thinking about what some of the expectations would be, like if you were working with someone outside of a treatment facility in recovery work, and kind of what it looks like after that. And if you have any questions on this, like please shoot us an email, fitfueledfree@gmail.com, and you can also direct message us on our Instagram at fitfueledfree, and you can find me and Jenna on our own pages. So mine is dietitian Danny Cast, and Jenna's is Jen Up Fit. And next week we're gonna talk about the navigating movement post-eating disorder part. So thank you guys so much for listening, and we will talk to you soon.
Bye guys.